The trawler, a scarred leviathan of rust and barnacles, bucked against the relentless churn of the slate-gray water. Dean, a man whose grief felt like a second skin, watched the mainland shrink to an indistinct smudge, the last tether to a life he no longer recognized. The salt spray, icy and sharp, plastered strands of his dark hair to his forehead, but he barely registered the chill. His focus was fixed on the approaching silhouette. An island, a jagged tooth on the horizon, crowned by the solitary sentinel of a lighthouse. This was his inheritance, his grandfather's desolate refuge, and perhaps his own. The journey had been long, a blur of silent ferries and cramped buses, each mile taking him further from the echoing emptiness of his old apartment, further from the phantom scent of jasmine and the quiet hum of a life extinguished too soon. He clutched the worn leather satchel containing his cartography tools, maps, and the single faded photograph he still carried. He was here for solitude, for the raw, unyielding embrace of the elements, hoping they might scour away the persistent ache in his chest. As the trawler drew closer, the island revealed its true nature. A craggy mass of dark rock, its slopes clad in tough, wind-whipped grasses. A perpetual mist seemed to cling to its highest points, lending it an air of ancient, brooding mystery. The lighthouse, stark white against the tumultuous sky, stood guard over the treacherous shoals, its beam a slow, rhythmic blink. Below it, clinging to the cliff face like a limpet, was the cottage. Even from this distance, its decay was evident. Peeling paint, a sagging porch, windows that stared out like vacant eyes. The fisherman, a burly man with hands like knotted rope, cut the engine with a cough and a sputter, the sudden quiet amplified by the crashing waves against the rocky inlet. "This is it, then," the man grunted, his voice rough as barnacles. He pointed to a rickety wooden dock, barely more than a few planks lashed together. "Mind your step. Tides can be tricky." Dean nodded, his throat tight. He hoisted his rucksack and the satchel, the weight familiar and grounding. He stepped onto the unsteady planks, the wood groaning beneath his boots. The air here was different, heavier, thick with the scent of brine, damp rock, and something else. Something earthy and metallic, like old pennies left out in the rain. The path to the cottage was steep and overgrown, the gravel crunching underfoot, the resilient island flora clawing at his trousers. He moved with a determined stride, his grief a heavy anchor, yet a flicker of purpose pushed him forward. He had to make this work. He would make this work. The cottage itself was smaller than he'd imagined, yet more imposing. Its granite walls were streaked with lichen, and the slate roof sagged in places. The front door, a heavy slab of warped oak, resisted his first push, scraping loudly against the threshold before finally yielding with a sigh of protest. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light filtering through grimy windows. Furniture, draped in faded white sheets, loomed like ghostly figures. Dean moved through the small living room, his footsteps echoing on the bare floorboards. He pulled back a sheet from a sturdy wooden table, revealing its scarred surface, then another from a worn armchair. His grandfather, a man he barely remembered, had lived out his days here, alone with the ceaseless roar of the ocean. He found the kitchen, its cupboards empty save for a few cobwebbed tins. The bedroom, sparse and Spartan, offered a narrow cot. It was all so utterly, completely solitary. A part of him, the raw, wounded part, exhaled in relief. This was what he had craved. An absence of demands, of sympathetic glances, of the world's relentless momentum. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of bruised purple and gray, Dean unpacked his essentials. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that seeped through the ill-fitting window frames, joining the ceaseless thrum of the waves. It wasn't just the wind, though. He heard other sounds now, too, or thought he did. A faint, irregular thump, thump, thump from somewhere beneath the floorboards. almost like a distant, sluggish heartbeat. He paused, listening intently, but it ceased as quickly as it began. He dismissed it as the house settling, or the wind playing tricks. He explored the small cottage more thoroughly, opening creaking cupboards, running his hands along rough-hewn shelves. In a dusty corner of the kitchen, beneath a stack of old, water-stained nautical charts, he found it. A crudely drawn map, almost faded to illegibility. It depicted the island, with the lighthouse and cottage marked, but his gaze was drawn to a cryptic X near the base of the cliffs, just beyond the perimeter of the cottage's property. Scrawled next to it, in his grandfather's distinctive shaky hand, were 2 words: underground bunker. Why would his grandfather have an underground bunker? The map offered no further details, no explanation. It was a secret, nestled within the folds of the island's forgotten history. The thump, thump, thump returned, a little louder this time. A slow, deliberate rhythm that resonated in the quiet room. It felt less like the house settling and more like something else was present. Something hidden, breathing beneath the earth. And Dean, by inheriting this place, had inherited its secrets too. The island, he realized, wasn't just a refuge. It was a vault, and he had just turned the key. The air here was different, heavier, thick with the scent of brine, damp rock, and something else. Something earthy and metallic, like old blood mixed with wet clay. Dean squinted. The fog a living, breathing thing that swirled around the rickety dock, swallowing the distant horizon. He pushed off, the small skiff groaning its protest, and stepped onto the shore of the island. It was less a shore and more a tangle of seaweed-slicked boulders and black volcanic sand that crunched under his boots. The cottage stood a short climb up a winding, overgrown path. It was a squat stone structure, defiant against the relentless coastal winds, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the turbulent sea. A rusted iron lantern hung beside the front door, its glass blackened with age. He fumbled with the heavy, salt-pitted key, the mechanism grating before finally yielding. Inside, the air was cold and still, thick with the smell of mildew and dust, overlaid with a faint, unsettling aroma of something unidentifiable, like dried kelp and forgotten spices. He dropped his bags, the thud echoing in the silence. A narrow staircase, creaking with every step, led to a single bedroom above. He dragged his rucksack upstairs, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and threw it onto the lumpy mattress. This was it. Solitude. A fresh start. He told himself this with a conviction that felt more like a prayer than a statement. The first few days were a blur of unpacking, cleaning, and simply existing in the quiet. Dean mapped the cottage in his mind, cataloged its few possessions. He spent hours at the large, grimy window, watching the sea. He had always found comfort in its vastness, its predictable rhythm. But here, the rhythm felt off. He noticed it first during a low tide. The water receded further than he'd ever witnessed, exposing vast stretches of slick, black rock usually hidden beneath the waves. The exposed seabed wasn't just bare rock. Strange, bulbous formations, like calcified growths, clung to the submerged cliff faces, twisting and writhing in grotesque, silent slow motion as the water pulled back. He watched, fascinated and disturbed, as the ocean seemed to hold its breath, the exposed shoreline stretching out like a skeletal hand. Then, with an unnatural swiftness, the tide surged back in, swallowing the strange forms, the water frothing and churning with an almost aggressive energy. He checked his tide charts, scoffed at the discrepancy. A local anomaly, he decided, a quirk of the island's unique geology. Nothing more. They began subtly, carried on the relentless wind that howled around the cottage. At first, he dismissed them as the mournful cries of gulls, or the sea's own voice echoing through the rocky inlets. But as the days bled into nights, the sounds grew more distinct. They weren't words, not exactly, but a low, guttural murmur, a chorus of sibilant sighs that seemed to ebb and flow with the tide. Sometimes, he swore he could almost make out a pattern, a rhythm to the sounds, like a chant. He'd pause, his hand freezing over a half-drawn map, straining to hear. His mind was manufacturing things. One blustery afternoon, while attempting to clear out a small, damp storage room beneath the cottage, a space that smelled intensely of brine and cold stone, his hand brushed against a loose stone in the wall. Curiosity piqued. He pried it open. Behind it, not a hidden cache of treasure, but a small, rectangular alcove. Inside, nestled amongst cobwebs and dried seaweed, was a single object, a leather-bound journal. The pages, when he carefully opened it, were brittle, many fused together, others covered in a spidery, almost illegible script. He carried it upstairs, placing it gently on the rough wooden table. The first few pages were standard entries, weather observations, supply lists. But then, the script changed, growing more erratic, the lines slanting wildly across the page. Mixed in with the frantic handwriting were disturbing sketches, abstract, swirling patterns that seemed to mimic the strange formations he'd seen on the seabed, intertwined with distorted, elongated figures that were neither fish nor human. They had too many limbs, too many eyes, and a terrifying, fluid grace. He felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. His grandfather had been a recluse, yes, but this was something else. He turned a page, the brittle paper almost tearing. His eyes landed on a recurring phrase, underlined multiple times, scrawled in thick, desperate strokes. The deep song. And then, almost as an afterthought, a hastily drawn map, crudely marked with an X and the words, "Underground bunker, keeper's secret." He tried to rationalize it all. The bizarre tidal patterns? Coincidence. The wind, playing on a stressed mind. The journal. The ramblings of an eccentric. A tremor ran through him. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He was alone here. The silence, broken only by the relentless sigh of the waves against the crags and the mournful cry of gulls, pressed in on him. He found himself constantly scanning the fog-shrouded windows, a vague anxiety tightening his chest. He'd come for solitude, for a fresh start, but the island offered only a deeper, more unsettling quiet. He began his investigation with the cottage itself. His grandfather, a man Dean barely remembered, had left behind a trove of forgotten things. Maps, of course, meticulously drawn charts of the local coastline, some with curious hand-drawn annotations in the margins that looked less like navigational notes and more like cryptic symbols. These maps lay scattered across a heavy oak desk, beneath a sputtering oil lamp. Dean spent hours poring over them, his fingers tracing the contours of the island, the deep, dark lines of the sea floor. He saw no hidden cities, no ancient temples, only depths. But the marginalia, those strange, looping symbols prickled at the back of his mind. His grandfather's journal was another matter entirely. Earlier entries had been mundane, records of weather and lighthouse maintenance. But as Dean delved deeper, the script grew frantic, less legible. The tides will turn, the depths will claim what is owed. What pact? What was owed? Determined to find answers beyond the increasingly incoherent scrawl, Dean sought out the island's sparse historical records. The main settlement, a cluster of weathered buildings clinging to a small harbor, housed a tiny, barely maintained collection of local lore. A grizzled fisherman, his face a roadmap of sun and salt, directed Dean to a forgotten corner of the old community hall. If you're looking for the real old stories, the ones they don't print in tourist pamphlets, the fisherman rasped, you'll find them down in the underground bunker. Used to be a storage for the old records, back when the lighthouse was first built. Creepy place, but it holds the truth, they say. Dean found the entrance to the underground bunker tucked into the side of a moss-covered hill, hidden by a tangle of thorny gorse bushes. The heavy, rusted metal door groaned open with a sound like a dying beast, revealing a flight of damp, uneven stone steps descending into absolute blackness. Inside, the underground bunker was a single, cramped chamber, shelves overflowing with brittle ledgers, yellowed maps, and bundles of parchment tied with fraying twine. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and something else. Something vaguely saline and earthy, like the tidal pools after a storm, but more potent. He pulled down a thick, leather-bound volume, its title barely legible. Isle of Cinder, Ancient Tales and Local Superstitions. The book spoke of a sunken city beneath the waves, not as a myth, but as a historical fact, guarded by keepers and bound by ancient rites. It detailed ceremonial offerings made to the Deep Ones to ensure the island's safety, a pact stretching back generations. The language was archaic, veiled, but the implication was clear. The island's prosperity, its very existence, was tied to something vast and terrible slumbering below. He read about periods of unrest, when the sea grew turbulent, when strange lights were seen far out in the fog, and when islanders simply vanished. The hairs on his arms prickled. That night, the dreams began. He found himself suspended in an endless, inky blackness, a crushing pressure all around him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. There was a sound, not a sound really, but a vibration, a low, resonant thrumming that resonated deep within his bones, an ancient, sorrowful song that promised oblivion. He woke with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs, his bedsheets tangled around him like seaweed. He swung his legs out of bed, his head throbbing. As his eyes adjusted to the dim pre-dawn light filtering through the window, he noticed it. On the rough-hewn floorboards near the fireplace, a faint, ethereal glow pulsed. He knelt, his hand trembling as he reached out. It was a patch of algae, vibrant and otherworldly, a phosphorescent green that pulsed with its own internal light. It wasn't just on the floorboards. Thin tendrils of it snaked up the stone hearth, clinging to the rough mortar. It was slick to the touch, cool and strangely soft, leaving a faint, shimmering residue on his fingertips. This was no ordinary growth. This was a manifestation, a physical intrusion of the profound strangeness that had begun to infest his dreams and the very fabric of the island. The metallic scent from the dock, the earthy tang in the underground bunker. It was all here, encapsulated in this glowing alien life. The island wasn't just affecting his mind. It was leaving its mark on his reality. The heavy door, a rusted slab of iron, stood ajar, a black maw in the side of the hill. He hesitated, his hand still on the cold, rough metal, a tremor running through his arm. Curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need for answers, warred with a primal urge to slam the door shut and flee. The grandfather had kept this hidden for a reason. Dean had to know what it was. He clicked on his powerful flashlight, the beam a stark white spear cutting through the absolute blackness. It illuminated a flight of uneven stone steps, slick with condensation, descending sharply. The air grew colder with each step, a bone-deep chill that no amount of clothing could ward off. Dean descended slowly, his boots scraping softly on the gritty stone, the sound echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The steps ended abruptly on a packed earth floor, leading into a low-ceilinged chamber. The beams swept across the walls, revealing them to be crudely excavated rock, shored up in places with crumbling, sea-worn timber. A faint cloying smell hung in the air here, distinct from the damp earth. An aroma like stagnant brine mixed with dried blood and something vaguely floral, sickly sweet. Dean swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. His light found a rough-hewn table in the center of the chamber, carved directly from the bedrock. And then, the journals. Several leather-bound notebooks, their covers stiff with age and moisture, lay stacked beside a collection of intricate hand-drawn maps that Dean immediately recognized as his grandfather's work. He picked up the topmost journal, its pages brittle. The grandfather's familiar, looping script filled the pages, but the tone was different, frantic. Dean skimmed, his eyes catching phrases. The hum grows stronger. Offerings. The sea claims its due. It sees through the water. Dean felt a profound unease settle deep in his gut. His grandfather hadn't just been observing. He'd been actively engaged with something. Something he clearly feared. The objects, the symbols, the desperate tone of the entries. It all pointed to a desperate, ancient pact, an attempt to ward off something by appeasing it. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears so much as felt in his bones. A deep vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, from the depths below the island. It was unsettling, like standing inside a giant, slow-beating heart. He looked around wildly, his flashlight beam dancing, but there was nothing to see, just the damp stone walls. Back in the cottage, the familiar scent of wood smoke and old paper did little to soothe him. The hum, however, had followed him. He tried to ignore it, setting the journal down on the kitchen table. He poured himself a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly. As he lifted the glass, a small, heavy brass compass, a family heirloom that usually sat on the mantelpiece, slid across the polished wood of the table, scraping softly, and fell to the floor with a dull thud. Dean stared at it, then at the empty space on the mantelpiece, then back at the compass. There was no draft, no tremor in the house. He bent down slowly, picking it up. The glass was cracked. He went to the small bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, and looked up into the mirror. For a split second, his reflection wavered. His skin appeared to ripple, like an image viewed through disturbed water. Then, just as quickly, it snapped back, his own tired, pale face staring back at him. Dean blinked, rubbing his eyes, telling himself it was exhaustion, a trick of the light. But the image, that fleeting distortion, clung to his mind like a persistent burr. Later, as twilight bled across the sky, painting the windows in hues of bruised purple, the hum grew stronger, a constant low thrum that made his teeth ache. He was standing by the window, staring out at the churning gray sea, when he saw it. It was a shape, tall and indistinct, like a column of swirling dark water, coalescing from the mist and shadow that clung to the cliffs. It seemed to stretch, reaching impossibly towards the cottage. Dean froze, his breath caught in his throat, every instinct screaming at him to move, to run, to hide. The hum intensified, a deafening roar in his mind. It hadn't been a trick of the light. It hadn't been exhaustion. It had been there. And it had seen him. The grandfather's warnings, the strange symbols, the offerings in the underground bunker. They weren't just the ravings of a solitary old man. They were a desperate plea. A futile battle against something ancient and utterly terrifying. Something that was now making its presence known, inch by encroaching inch, in Dean's new, desolate home. His hand, still numb from the cold iron of the door, slipped inside the gap. The darkness within the underground bunker was absolute, a palpable weight that pressed against his eyes. He fumbled for the heavy-duty lantern he'd brought from the cottage, its beam cutting a stark, trembling path through the gloom. The bunker was not what he'd expected. The floor, uneven and gritty under his boots, sloped gently downwards. The sound of his own breathing seemed deafening, ragged in the still air. He moved cautiously, the lantern's beam dancing over crude carvings etched into the stone. Not mere graffiti, but symbols he recognized from the journal. Swirling lines and angular forms, repeated over and over like a mantra rendered in stone. They pulsed with a strange, latent energy in the shifting light, making his skin prickle. Beside it, a collection of peculiar implements, a heavy, blunt chisel, a small, rusted bowl, and a cluster of dried, brittle weeds bound together with sinew. He ran a finger over the bowl's rim. It felt porous, ancient. On the table, beneath a thin layer of grit, lay a stack of loose papers, yellowed and brittle. More of his grandfather's meticulous script. He carefully gathered them, tucking them into his satchel. Back in the cottage, the familiar scent of brine and old wood offered little comfort. The papers from the bunker lay spread across the kitchen table, illuminated by the flickering oil lamp. Dean poured himself a mug of lukewarm coffee, his hands trembling slightly, and began to read. The entries were different from the earlier ones. Less observational, more visceral, desperate. His grandfather wasn't just chronicling an awakening. He was actively engaged in a struggle. The cryptic references to the deep song became clearer. It wasn't just a metaphor for the entity's influence, but a literal sonic assault. The hum grows, a pressure behind the eyes, a vibration in the bones. It seeks to unravel thought, to unbind the self. The pact holds, but it demands. More. The offerings are vital. The sea will take its due. Offerings? Due? The deep song wasn't just a distant thrum anymore. As he read, a low, resonant vibration began to permeate the cottage, subtle at first, like the distant rumble of a storm, then deepening, settling into the very marrow of his bones. It wasn't sound he heard with his ears, but felt with his entire being. The words on the page seemed to shimmer, the ink blurring, twisting into unfamiliar patterns. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the distortions persisted. The familiar grain of the wooden table seemed to writhe, knots expanding and contracting like slow, diseased organs. It's the lack of sleep, the stress, this place. But the deep song was undeniable now, a profound bass note that seemed to originate from the very core of the island, vibrating up through the floorboards, through his chair, into his skull. It wasn't just auditory, it was cognitive. His thoughts felt sluggish, thick, as if wading through unseen currents. Memories felt less distinct, the edges blurring into a generalized anxiety. He read on, the journal detailing the great confluence, a specific alignment of tides and lunar cycles when the entity's influence was strongest. His grandfather had documented a series of countermeasures, rituals performed at specific points around the island. One entry, however, seized his attention, scribbled in a frantic, almost illegible hand. The heart of it, the true nexus. Not the shore, not the bunker, but below the eye. The light must be sustained. The seal must be reinforced. It waits beneath the stone. The blood of the pact. Below the eye, Dean murmured, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. The lighthouse. The source of light, the beacon. He looked up, his gaze drawn to the tall, cylindrical structure looming outside the window, its beams sweeping across the fog-shrouded landscape. The deep song seemed to intensify, urging him, pulling him towards it. The cottage felt too small, too fragile to contain the pressure. He grabbed the lantern again, the journal clutched in his other hand. Inside, the familiar spiral staircase seemed to stretch endlessly, each step echoing the insistent thrum in his head. He descended, not ascending. The journal mentioned beneath the stone. He remembered the old, rusted trapdoor in the keeper's living quarters, beneath a threadbare rug, usually ignored. He'd assumed it was a small storage space, maybe a root cellar. He pushed aside the rug, revealing the heavy wooden door. He pulled at the rusted ring handle. The trapdoor groaned open, revealing a shaft of absolute blackness, even deeper than the bunker. He aimed the lantern down. What he saw wasn't a cellar, but a rough-hewn tunnel descending into the bedrock, its walls glistening with moisture. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and decay, and a faint rhythmic thump-thump that was not his own heartbeat. But his grandfather's frantic words echoed in his head. The light must be sustained. The seal must be reinforced. A desperate resolve hardened his features. The deep song pulsed, a low thrum against his eardrums, vibrating through the very soles of his boots as he stood at the base of the lighthouse. Below the eye, he'd whispered, the words a raw offering to the sea mist. The beams swept over him, a fleeting caress of light, then plunged his back into the swirling gray. He traced the rough-hewn stone of the lighthouse's foundation, his fingers gritty against the cold, damp surface. He wasn't looking for a door, not in the conventional sense. His cartographer's eye scanned for anomalies, for a subtle disruption in the pattern, a telltale sign of human intervention disguised by time and the relentless salt air. The deep song grew louder, a pressure in his chest, pulling at something deep within him. He walked the perimeter, his gaze fixed on the ground where the massive stone structure met the earth. The fog swirled, thick and insistent, muffling the distant roar of the waves, sharpening the immediacy of the deep song. Then he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible line in the rock face, partially obscured by a thick growth of hardy seagrass and lichen. It wasn't a seam, but a deliberate cut, a faint rectangular outline that suggested a hidden entrance. He knelt, scraping away the clinging vegetation with frantic fingers. Beneath, a rusted iron ring, almost swallowed by corrosion, lay flush with the stone. He tugged. It resisted, groaning with the weight of years. He braced his feet, pulling with all his strength, the deep song now a roar in his ears, urging him on. A narrow, winding staircase, slick with condensation, spiraled downwards into impenetrable blackness. The deep song seemed to emanate directly from this new opening, a siren's call from the earth itself. But the question, the gnawing curiosity that had driven him to this island, was too potent to ignore. He pulled out the sturdy torch from his pack, its beam cutting a shaky swathe through the gloom. The staircase spiraled, seemingly endless, until it finally opened into a vast circular chamber. This was the underground bunker. The torch beam swept across the cavernous space. The walls were rough-hewn rock, but unlike the raw stone of the stairs, these were carved, etched with symbols he didn't recognize. The air here was still, stagnant, yet charged with a palpable energy that made the hairs on his arms prickle. In the center of the chamber, an altar of sorts, a rough block of black, glassy stone, stood bathed in an unearthly, faint luminescence. And upon it, or perhaps within it, was the source of the light and the deep song. It wasn't an artifact in the traditional sense. No carved idol or ancient tome. It wasn't a reflection of light. It was light. A swirling vortex of deep blues, greens, and impossible purples that shifted and coalesced. This was no mere portal. It was a window, or perhaps an eye, into something else entirely. His gaze was drawn, mesmerized, into the swirling depths of the luminescence. The deep song intensified, and suddenly, the chamber around him seemed to dissolve. He was no longer in the underground bunker. He was there. Colossal shapes, indistinct yet monstrous, drifted through the blackness, their forms hinted at by the faint bioluminescent currents that swirled around them. There was no up or down, only an endless crushing pressure. Then, the island. His island. His very consciousness felt like it was unraveling, threads of his identity dissolving into the cosmic indifference of the deep. The entity. This was its true nature. Not a beast, not a spirit, but something ancient beyond human comprehension. An intelligence of the deep that sought not to destroy, but to absorb, to reclaim. The vision was not of an attack, but of a slow, inevitable reintegration. He was witnessing his own unmaking. He understood. This wasn't just a secret. It was a slow, deliberate encroaching, a patient hunger from beneath the waves. The entity wasn't coming for him. It was already here, and it was drawing him, drawing everything into its fathomless embrace. He was a cartographer, accustomed to mapping the known world. But this was a map to his own dissolution. The beam swept over him, a fleeting caress of light, then plunged his back into the suffocating gloom. But this time, it was different. The song wasn't just in his ears. It was in him. A cold, invasive tendril of sensation coiled around his spine, prickling his nerves. It was as if a vast, unseen mouth pressed against his skull, inhaling his very essence. His vision blurred, the familiar granite of the lighthouse walls shimmering like heat haze. He stumbled, catching himself on the damp stone, his fingers scraping raw. It's trying to get in, he realized, a terrifying certainty blooming in his chest. It's not just watching anymore. It's trying to breach. A wave of nausea washed over him, bile rising in his throat. He couldn't stay here. The lighthouse, once a beacon of his quest, had become a conduit. He scrambled away from the base, his breath ragged gasps in the heavy air. The deep song intensified, a roar now, vibrating the very ground beneath his feet. He could feel its pressure, a crushing weight against his spirit, threatening to flatten him, to consume the small, flickering light of his identity. His gaze swept desperately across the familiar, yet suddenly menacing landscape of the island. The cottage was too exposed. The thought of the old keeper's journal, his grandfather's cryptic words, flashed in his mind. The underground bunker. It was his only chance. A place built to withstand the elements, perhaps even the unseen. Dean ran, his legs pumping, his lungs burning. The mist swirled around him, thick and cloying, an extension of the entity's breath. He imagined vast, unseen tendrils reaching, testing the edges of his sanity, pulling at him. But then he remembered the faces, the unspoken words, the grief that still clung to him like a shroud. He couldn't. Not like this. He burst through the undergrowth, tearing his jacket on the thorny branches, his skin stinging. He fumbled with the latch, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the heavy iron key. He plunged into the black, slamming the door shut behind him. He fumbled for his lantern, his fingers clumsy. His grandfather's journal, wrapped in oilskin, lay exactly where he'd left it. He snatched it up, his breath still catching in his throat. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, scanned the cramped, frantic script. He flipped through pages, his desperation mounting. He needed answers. He needed a weapon. There had to be a way to stop it, to seal the gateway, to sever the connection. The handwriting was jagged, nearly illegible, as if his grandfather had been writing in a fever. There were references to the binding, the sacrifice, and the anchor. Dean's fingers trembled as he deciphered the faded ink. The pact must be honored, or broken, to break it, a severance, not of life, but of lineage. A cutting of the thread, the deepest sorrow offered back, a piece of oneself, a promise, the bond of blood twisted to repel. To seal the eye that watches from below, the keeper must offer the echo of what was lost. The sorrow, given form. Dean read the words again and again, the meaning slowly congealing into a horrifying clarity. A piece of oneself. His grandfather hadn't just been documenting a threat. He'd been outlining a terrible final solution. A ritual, incomplete in its details, vague in its execution, but horrifyingly clear in its requirement. He had to give up the memory of what he'd lost, to sever the emotional anchor to his past, to consciously unmoor himself from the very essence of his identity, the memory of his family. It wasn't just forgetting. It was a tearing away of the most sacred part of his being, a deliberate erasure of the love and the pain that defined him. The implications hit him with the force of a physical blow. The entity would be repelled, but what would be left of Dean? He was trapped. The deep song, though muffled, still pressed against the concrete walls of the underground bunker, a reminder of the creeping horror outside. The choice was stark, agonizing, and unavoidable. The island was a living wound. Dean watched from the cottage's salt-blasted window as the morning, if such a concept still applied, struggled to break through a suffocating shroud of black-green fog. The air itself thrummed with a low, persistent hum that vibrated in his teeth, a sound that seemed to emanate not from the atmosphere, but from the very bedrock of the island. Outside, the world was unraveling. The twisted pines that clung to the cliffs were no longer merely gnarled. Their branches seemed to writhe, slow and deliberate, their needles glistening with a viscous dark dew that wasn't rain. He'd seen it earlier, a patch of the familiar island moss near the path, usually a vibrant emerald, now swollen and purplish, pulsing faintly as if an internal organ had been exposed. Even in the distance, the lighthouse beam, which had been his only constant, seemed to stutter, its light struggling to pierce the encroaching gloom, growing dimmer with each desperate sweep. This was it. The entity was no longer merely stirring. It was reaching, grasping, its influence bleeding into the physical world. It was a tangible manifestation of the psychic pressure he'd felt building for days, now amplified to an unbearable crescendo. His own mind felt like a frayed rope, stretched taut, threatening to snap. He clutched the worn leather journal, its pages brittle beneath his thumb, the final horrifying instructions burned into his memory. A piece of oneself. It wasn't just a sacrifice, not merely a relinquishing of something precious. It was a profound, intimate severance. The entity didn't want his life, not entirely. The counter-ritual wasn't about banishment. It was about re-imprisonment, a sealing of the forgotten pact, and the price was a piece of his very soul, the part that still clung to the memory of what was gone. He would have to rip it out, expose it, and offer it. He would do it. For the island, for the fading light, for himself. Each item felt heavy with purpose, imbued with the crushing weight of his decision. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if wading through treacle. The path to the underground bunker was a nightmare rendered real. The ground beneath his boots felt spongy, the earth itself seeming to sag and heave. He passed the skeletal remains of what had once been a familiar gannet, now grotesquely elongated, its beak distended, its wings fused into a single ragged membrane, its eyes, once bright, replaced by vacant black pits that seemed to follow him. He averted his gaze, a shudder working its way up his spine. The island was truly lost, consumed by the encroaching horror. The wind howled with a new, guttural voice, carrying the scent of decay and something else. A faint, metallic tang that made his stomach clench. The roar of the sea was constant, a predatory growl. The entrance to the underground bunker. It was a crude affair, a heavy, rusted steel hatch set into the side of a low, rocky outcrop, almost entirely swallowed by the encroaching, mutated vegetation. It groaned open, a sound like a tortured beast, revealing a gaping maw of absolute blackness. His small, battery-powered lantern cut a weak swathe through the gloom, revealing rough-hewn stone walls, water beading on their surface, and a floor of packed earth. The space was small, circular, clearly a forgotten storage or observation post from a bygone era, now repurposed by his grandfather for a desperate final stand. In the center of the floor, a roughly drawn circle in chalk, faded but still visible, beckoned. He knelt, placing the journal carefully beside the circle. His breath plumed in the cold air. The distant, vibrating hum of the island was muted here, but not absent. A low, persistent thrumming that seemed to resonate within his own bones. This was the vessel, the anchor. With painstaking precision, his hands steady despite the tremor in his soul, he He began to carve the ancient binding symbols into the smooth surface of the wood. He focused on the task, on the tactile sensation of the wood beneath his fingers, the faint scent of timber mingling with the bunker's earthy dampness. He thought of her, not of the pain, not yet, but of the warmth, the laughter, the quiet moments. He was preparing to offer the most potent, most agonizing piece of himself, the echo of what was lost, to force the entity back to its slumber. As the final symbol was etched, a faint, internal tremor shook the bunker. The hum from outside intensified, a rising drone. He uncorked the small vial, the deep crimson liquid swirling within. He was ready. Dean gripped the worn leather satchel, its contents a desperate gamble against an ancient horror. It pulsed beneath the bedrock, a slow, monstrous heartbeat drawing him deeper. He found the entrance concealed behind a tumble of sea-worn stones, a rusted metal hatch half buried in the overgrown soil. This was it, the point of no return. With a grunt, he wrenched the hatch open. He descended a ladder slick with condensation, his boots finding purchase on rungs that seemed to groan under his weight. The beam of his heavy-duty lantern cut a shaky swathe through the inky blackness, revealing rough-hewn rock walls weeping moisture. He could hear the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere ahead, amplified, distorted, sounding less like water and more like a slow, rhythmic thrumming. This was it, the nexus, the wound in reality. And within that chasm, the entity was fully manifest. It wasn't a creature of flesh and bone, nor a swirling vortex of energy. It was a maw of non-space, shimmering with impossible colors that hurt his eyes, colors that didn't exist in any spectrum he knew. He felt a pressure building behind his skull, a sensation of his sanity being stretched thin, like fragile glass. They were not words, but a cacophony of lost hopes, forgotten fears, and above all, grief. His grief. The entity was a living echo chamber, amplifying his sorrow, twisting it into a weapon. He saw her face, vivid as if she stood before him, her smile, the way her hair caught the light. He felt the crushing weight of loss all over again, a fresh wave of agony that threatened to buckle his knees. It wanted him to drown in it, to surrender. No, Dean rasped, his voice raw, barely audible against the internal storm. He knew what it wanted. It didn't want his life, not entirely. It wanted the resonance of his most profound grief, the very core of his being that had been irrevocably shaped by loss. It wanted him to feed it, to offer it the raw, unadulterated essence of his pain. He forced his trembling legs to move, pulling a small, heavy wooden box from his satchel. Inside lay a single tarnished silver locket, the one possession he had clung to, the last tangible link to his past. It didn't want him to seal it. It wanted to consume. As he stepped closer to the chasm, the very ground beneath him began to shift. The rough stone walls of the bunker seemed to ripple, distorting, stretching into impossible angles. Gravity itself felt capricious, pulling him sideways, then forward. The air grew impossibly dense, pressing down on him, stealing his breath. He was being crushed, suffocated, not by physical force, but by the sheer, overwhelming presence of the other. "You won't have it," Dean choked out, tears streaming down his face. Not from sorrow now, but from the brutal pressure on his psyche. This was the sacrifice. Not just the locket, but what it represented. The pain. The love so intertwined with that pain. To seal the portal, he had to sever that connection, to offer the wound itself, leaving an emptiness that might never heal. He opened the locket, gazing at the faded photograph within. Her eyes. The bunker walls cracked, dust and debris raining down. The chasm itself began to convulse, its edges rippling like water, trying to spit out the offering, trying to reject the severance. Dean fought through the psychic assault, through the impossible weight. He pulled the last item from his satchel, a small, intricately carved bone totem, charged with the island's ancient power, a counter-ritual to the pact. It struck something unseen, and a shockwave of pure, raw energy exploded outwards. The chasm shrieked, a sound that transcended hearing, a tearing of reality itself. Dean stumbled backwards, shielding his eyes, feeling the sheer force of the entity's desperate struggle. The ground bucked violently, the standing stones cracking and toppling. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The blinding light winked out. The roar died to a residual hum. The chasm was still there, but it was no longer a maw of cosmic horror. The pressure eased. The walls of the bunker solidified, though new cracks spiderwebbed across them. Dean stood alone in the crumbling chamber, gasping for breath, his body trembling, his mind a raw, bleeding wound. The entity was gone, sealed away. But the cost, the locket, the symbol of his deepest grief, was gone. He had saved the island, but he wasn't sure what he had become. The air in the underground bunker was a cold, wet shroud, pressing in on Dean from all sides. Each step downward on the rough-hewn steps echoed with a hollow, dripping sound that seemed to consume the light from his lantern, leaving only hungry shadows. He gripped the worn leather satchel tighter, the leather rough against his clammy palm, its contents a desperate, fragile gamble against an ancient, crushing weight. The deep song, which had been a distant thrum on the surface, now vibrated through the very rock. A low, guttural chant that resonated in his bones, threatening to unravel the delicate weave of his thoughts. He had to see this through. There was no other choice. The lantern beam struggled against the immensity, revealing walls of glistening black stone slick with condensation. Strange, ancient carvings snaked across every surface. Spirals, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in his peripheral vision, and grotesque, half-formed figures with too many limbs and eyes that never quite met his gaze. Around it, 4 smaller pedestals, each bearing a shallow, eroded basin. This was the place. This was where the pact had been made, where it had been broken. It was waiting. It had always been waiting. It pulsed with a faint internal light, a deep, unsettling violet. This was the focus, the anchor, and with it, a folded, brittle parchment covered in his grandfather's spidery hand. He laid the parchment on the central stone table, its surface surprisingly warm to the touch. The text was not a spell, but a series of precise instructions, a ritual of re-anchoring. His grandfather hadn't just kept the entity at bay. He had been its keeper, the lighthouse a beacon not for ships, but for the deep song, channeling its power, binding it to the island's core. The pact wasn't just forgotten. It was broken, the entity now free to exert its will beyond the bunker. And now, that role fell to Dean. The parchment detailed the process, the placement of the sphere, the specific incantations, and a final terrible requirement. Not a blood sacrifice, but a sacrifice of self. A profound connection to the island, a merging of his own consciousness with its ancient stony awareness, becoming an extension of its will, its guardian. This was the terrible cost. Dean placed the obsidian sphere into the central basin of the table. The deep song swelled, a frantic, hungry roar, as if the entity recognized the threat, or perhaps the offering. He began to read the incantations, his voice trembling at first, then growing stronger, fueled by a desperate resolve. The words were archaic, guttural, vibrating with a power that felt both alien and strangely familiar. The carvings on the walls seemed to deepen, their eyes fixed on him. The deep song shifted, becoming a chorus of discordant wails, then a singular piercing note that threatened to split his skull. He reached the final passage. It spoke of surrender, of acceptance, of becoming the island's voice, its eyes, its unbreakable will. He closed his eyes, focusing on the violet light emanating from the sphere, letting the ancient words flow from his lips, not just as sound, but as intention. The deep song enveloped him, not just in his ears, but in every fiber of his being. A terrifying symphony that now felt comprehensible. He felt the entity recoil, not in defeat, but in grudging acceptance of the new anchor, the new guardian. The overwhelming pressure receded, leaving behind a profound, unnerving stillness. The deep song softened, no longer a roar, but a constant low hum, a part of him now, echoing in the cavern of his mind. When Dean opened his eyes, the obsidian sphere still pulsed with violet light, but the chamber no longer felt hostile. Contained. He looked at his hands, then around the chamber. The carvings on the walls seemed less threatening, more like intricate maps, charts of unseen currents and pressures. He understood them, not intellectually, but instinctively. He was no longer Dean, the reclusive cartographer. He was Dean, the island's anchor, the deep song's reluctant keeper. The immediate threat was neutralized, bound once more beneath the island, but the cost was immeasurable. The world beyond the island now seemed distant, a faint, irrelevant echo.